So what I want to talk about today, you know, and it's sort of like every single day criminal law is in the news. And I want to get a little more philosophical. I'm, I'm trying to do something else so that I don't have to draw on this whiteboard, because you know my drawing is excellent. So yeah, some people are asking about an assignment that's not published yet. And yeah, you're right, you can't work on it because it's not published. So hang tight, we'll be getting to that. I'm gonna see if this, install. Let's find out what's gonna happen. This is exciting. I need the little Jeopardy music. Any rate, oh, okay. Hold on. If this works, it's gonna be really good. If this works, it's gonna be a lot better than whatever I've been doing, but no guarantee it's gonna work. There we go. Oh my gosh, this is genius. Hold on. Oh, MG. Okay, yay. Let's see if I can pull up something. What do I want to draw in? I think that'll work. Okay, so I think you guys can hear me. Oh, thank you. We just have a new page. Yeah, this is like gonna fail. Ay, caramba. Oh, and it's stopped working. Okay, let's give up on that one. Stop share. It was worth a try. Okay. I could get it to work about a month ago. It's not been working since. Okay, so here we go. I want you to understand like a fairly deep point about the system, if you will, and the criminal justice system broadly. So let's attempt to draw a triangle. It's kind of fun. Oops. Okay. So, and again, don't take if my triangle is not exactly even. It's not going to trip anybody else out that it's not. There we go. Okay, so you have to think of the criminal justice system broadly as a triangle. One leg of the criminal justice system, give branch, over here, let's move it over here. You have legislative branch, and this will be on like the midterm and final, even though it's not, like this is not in your book, this is just from my brain. Okay. So each, you know, if I could twist this, but whatever. So each side of the triangle represents one of the three branches of government. I'm sorry, my triangle is not even. It should be even, okay? And then what happens is that each side does their part and influences the eventual outcome, okay? And the eventual outcome right here, oh my gosh, this is so fun. I'm dying. It's almost like a legitimate drawing. So the middle of this eventual outcome is someone is found guilty of a crime. And there's also, oh my gosh, does anyone know TikTok? Oops. I am dying because has anyone seen the Christmas dance on TikTok? It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. That's become a TikTok thing. If you know that, drop a 1 in the chat box if you know what I'm talking about. I mean, yes, so my child is doing that TikTok on repeat. It's like a little charming little Christmas dance. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Okay, so the middle circle here is when someone is found guilty of a crime. But it could also be, as we get further in the class, at other points in the process, and we'll talk about that. So you have to remember as well, what does each branch of government essentially at its basic level do? So who wants to chat out? What does the legislative branch do at its most basic level? Like if you remember back from, I don't know, poli-sci, civics, what does the legislative branch do? And maybe what do they do specifically in terms of criminal law and criminal justice? You can chat in or unmute yourself. Nobody knows what there you go. Legislative branch, thank you, Norma. They create the law, okay. Oops, there's an extra E on the end of that. So they create the law, they pass the laws, they pass the statutes. This is super easy to see in criminal law because what do we have? We have penal code, right? Criminal law is a product of a statute. There's not a common law, criminal law, okay? Common law would be through some sort of civil court. There is only criminal law that has been codified through statutes that someone can then be charged. So the legislative branch, what they contribute to this procedure is creating the law and deciding which behavior will be criminalized, which behaviors in a society will be deemed unacceptable and thus, prosecuted. Like if you engage in this behavior, you can be subject to loss of freedom, prosecution, all of that. So your legislative branch contributes that. And it is important, we'll come back. Anyway, okay, so then the executive branch. What does the executive branch do broadly, and how does it kind of weigh into this situation?
It enforces the laws.
Yes, I don't know who said that, but it enforces the law. Perfect, I couldn't see who said it. And then we've also got Richard chatting it in. So E for enforce, E for executive branch, they enforce the law. So again, super important to see how this plays out in specifically a criminal setting. So the legislative branch has passed a law to make something criminal, to say this is outside what is acceptable behavior for this society, this county, this state, whatever, this federal government. And then the executive branch enforces that. And sometimes people forget this, and I know it's in that first chapter of your book, but your local law enforcement, police, FBI, ATF, all that, they are functions underneath the executive branch, right? So they are representatives under the executive branch. So too is the prosecutor, okay? Like the district attorney, the prosecutor, as well as the assistant DAs, all the people underneath, they are all representatives of the executive branch. It's down the line, but they're all under that large umbrella of the executive branch because all of their role is somehow tied into enforcing the law. And on a deep level where you can see this, we'll come back to that. We'll lay out the basics and we'll kind of play with some things. Okay, judicial branch. What does the judicial branch do? Oh, great, Robin, I see you chatting out first. Interpret the law. And sometimes people are like, what does that mean? It says what it means. Right, so they interpret the law, define the law. Perfect, I love that, Chris, thank you. So interpret the law, say what it means. Does it fit? Is it constitutional? Some of those broad questions. So they interpret the law. And so kind of having those basics out, and then keep in mind, everything comes before the judicial branch. So let's layer in, and so you may want to, you know, kind of write notes as you feel you need to here, because I'm not sure I'm going to add more things to this. So legislative branch sets something out as a crime. They pass a statute, XYZ is now a crime to engage in. Maybe it's revenge porn. You know, sometimes you think of like criminal law as just being the old school basics, like, you know, murder, arson, kidnapping. But technology, advancements in society, as things change, you can have new avenues for criminal behavior. You know, revenge porn, even if it might have happened like 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't, you know what I mean? It just wasn't kind of the same thing that it is now. So you can have kind of new crimes emerge, you know, new abilities, new crimes emerge. You can also have society kind of change their minds about things. But at any rate, so you have the legislative branch passes a law, makes something criminal. You can also think of this even in terms of like marijuana, things we're seeing right now. Then the only way, and so this is where I want you to start to think about how each branch contributes to that middle dot of someone being found guilty, right, to some extent. The only way someone can be found guilty of breaking this criminal statute is if the legislative branch has first said it's a crime to do this, okay? But then the only way someone could be found guilty is if the executive branch is actually enforcing this law, meaning if someone is engaging this behavior, we will charge them, arrest them. And there's multiple stages here. And that's what's kind of interesting as we get later in the chapters. You know, just because you're arrested doesn't mean you're going to be found guilty, right? Just because you're arrested doesn't mean the prosecutor's going to go forward with charges. Just because the prosecutor goes forward with charges doesn't mean XYZ. There's many points along this where things can kind of end and change. So the executive branch has to be willing to enforce this law, you know, and we saw this kind of probably the mid 2000s in California with marijuana, that most of your local law enforcement counties, agencies were just like, we're not going to arrest people for a single joint. Like it is currently still illegal in California at that point, you know, to have a joint or whatever, smoke marijuana, but we're just not going to do it. We're not going to arrest someone for that, because even if we do arrest someone for it, our prosecutor, our district attorney isn't going to bring charges because they know people won't convict. So kind of the way everything works, it's just not worth it. We're just not going to do it. And so in effect, because we won't enforce that law, right? The legislature can pass as many laws as they want, but if no one enforces it, then it's going to be virtually impossible to find anyone guilty of breaking that law, right? So the executive branch has the ability through, frankly, many avenues, local law enforcement, prosecutors, to decide if they're going to enforce or not enforce the law. And when you get really deep into philosophy of law, they talk about this theory of prosecutors and the role of the prosecution as a, let me make sure I write this right, sword or shield, right? So they can decide to prosecute you, and that's when it's like a sword, shoom, coming at you. But they can also decide not to prosecute you. And when someone decides not to prosecute you, it becomes like a shield, right? Protecting you from that liability. Like, well, you know, sort of like if the tree fell in the forest, but no one prosecuted you for it, you know, did it really happen? So the executive branch, if someone is going to be found guilty of a crime, has to weigh in, and really has to weigh in at a couple points. Have to be arrested, charges have to be brought, prosecutor has to be willing to, you know, go forward with those, the whole thing. So that's what the executive branch contributes to this. And then we get to the judicial branch, right? Interpret the law, but it's interpret the law, say what it means, but it's also kind of an oversight, right? It's more than just interpreting the law. It's really like ensuring due process. Oh, my doorbell's ringing. Hold on, I assume it's just a mail delivery. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. I know there was a hang tag. Right. Yeah. That's fine. Which way is the best way to get back here? You know what? Probably go the driveway because our fence is so messed up. Okay. Just come up the driveway and then you can just, it's like the patio. You can just walk. Good. I'll come back. Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm just teaching my online class. Oh, okay. You're fine. Hey, you guys, there's a mosquito person walking around, so don't worry. Don't mind me. LA County mosquito people doing what they do. Okay. So judicial branch. So it's more than just interpreting. It's also, it's really like looking out for due process rights and all these things. And what does that look like? So just because the legislature has created something as a criminal, as an act, right? They've said this is criminal behavior. That law itself could be challenged, right? Someone could say, have we seen with homelessness, right? One of those where that's an area that's come up. Like, can you really, you know what I mean? Like, what does that really mean? And even to some drug crimes. So you could absolutely have people saying, or even flag burning, right? If you pass a law that flag burning is illegal, that has been challenged and has been found. You cannot criminalize burning a flag because of the First Amendment. So there's already like a direct push and pull that if something is going to be criminalized, the judicial branch could push back on that, like through people, right, bringing the challenge, but they could push back on that. But assuming that it's that it's survived that and it is a crime, then when we get to the enforcement, right, the judicial branch can also weigh in on that. Like, well, are you enforcing it properly? Are you, violating other standards here? So kind of think of like the racial profiling type cases, yes, you can stop people that you think are drug dealers, but are you only stopping certain people? Are you only doing this? Is it a pretext? What's really going on? And if so, then that may be a problem. And that's before you get to the actual specifics of the individual case that an individual defendant is dealing with. So you've passed all that, you have a crime, a statute that is held to be, fine, it's a good statute. You have a situation where the local law enforcement and the prosecutor's office, right, are all on board with enforcing this. So someone's been charged. And this is what we'll see in more detail as we go in later chapters. But at each stage, the judicial branch is weighing really the probable cause. Are the charges, is there enough here to move forward with probable cause, PC? Will the defendant be held to answer? Sometimes no, right? Even before that, is there enough here for a warrant? Think back to chapter 2. The warrant isn't just a piece of paper, it's a piece of paper taken before a member of the judicial branch. And that member of the judicial branch has to sign off on it, right? And so already there's a check and balance there where a member of the judicial branch could say there's not enough here to arrest someone, and they do. Or there's not enough here for a search warrant, I need more details, or you're gonna have to try again. So that doesn't get reported, but that absolutely does happen. I mean, it gets reported sometimes, but it just is fairly routine, right? That they have to like try again. So there's absolutely that push and pull, and are charges even going to move forward? Are they going to be held to answer? And then at each stage, at the close of the prosecution's case, is there enough to move forward? Sometimes there's not. Usually there would be at that point, but you never know. At the end of the case, is there enough to let this go to the jury, right? That's a motion that can be made. Usually the answer is yes, but sometimes no. And then what happens to the jury? So the judicial branch, if someone is found to be guilty of a crime, and this is like the broad philosophical terms, it represents, and this is what I really want you to take away, it represents the unification of the three branches of government on a really deep level, because it says that the legislative branch has agreed this behavior is criminal. The executive branch has agreed to enforce this law, right? And when it's being broken. And the judicial branch has observed, monitored, but even more than that, right? They both agree that the law is valid, that the enforcement was valid, that there was probable cause, that they've overseen this, and whether it went to a jury or a judge trial. But the branch as a whole is sort of giving, I wouldn't say it's stamp of approval, I don't know, but it's like they are there as well. And if at any point they disagreed, right, then you wouldn't be able to have that person be guilty. They would be appealed, or whatever it might happen in the process. So when someone is found guilty of a crime, it's a really powerful moment that, you don't see kind of on the ground, but if you step back, you can see the unification of the three branches of government. And I think I've got to find someone who's written about this, because I can't imagine I'm the only person that's put it this way. So I'll try to find something for you guys, but I know it's not necessarily in the book this way. But I just think it's really powerful. And you can also get a sense of where you can start to push and pull, certain levers, and so that's why think about marijuana. So on the state level, right, for our state, it's legal, but the federal government level is still illegal. But so what do you have? You have the executive branch, and this is not legal advice, but basically saying in California, we won't enforce federal law as long as you stay in California for like single users. We won't do that. So essentially, it is legal, right, to some extent. I mean, they could still enforce the law, but it's, and you're never having a case come up. So it's very interesting. So there's a lot of power there. And I think when I find things getting stressful, it is interesting to come back to this basic idea that, and at every level, and I'll bring this up as we go through later parts, at every level, you're seeing the three branches kind of weigh in, right? Whether it's getting a warrant, where you directly see the judicial and the executive branch, right? And the only reason they're applying for a warrant is because it was something that the legislative branch said was criminal. So it's super fascinating to look for maybe that triad and that unification of the three branches throughout the process. I don't know. So it might make you more happy, less happy. I don't know, but we live in interesting, strange times. There's so much criminal law news being made all the time, but especially right now. And I'd say, look for these moments, and it's going to help you have a bigger appreciation for maybe the different branches, but also, where the pushes and pulls are that you could affect change, if that's your thing. And also who has power to do what. Super interesting. But when I like to think of that middle dot, if someone is found guilty of a crime, it's really the unification of the three branches, which is fascinating to me. So anyway, I don't know, any questions or comments on this? Maybe it's a little too much for Thursday. I've got like county bug inspection things happening. Let's see, I'm gonna pause it first. So you should definitely have this drawing in your notes because it will be on the midterm and probably the final. And we'll come back to it, and talk about where we see it playing out in different phases, because it plays out at the end, but it literally plays out in multiple phases, from simply having a warrant to moving forward. Yeah, cool. So I like that. I mean, this is a new way to think about it. Like I said, I can't imagine anything I've thought of as original because I read so much, and so I'm certain I must have read, I don't know, but maybe not. It was just from a few years ago from teaching this. I just realized it's really beautiful. It's deep, I'm gonna cry, but there's something really powerful about this. And because obviously if something hasn't been criminalized, you could never have a case about it. And what's interesting, you see some direct pull between the legislative branch and the executive branch all the time. I mean, all three, where, just because they've made something a crime. I mean, even think of the masks, like even think of coronavirus. I don't even know if that's really a crime. It might be an infraction or something. I don't know, a little citation if you're not wearing a mask where you're supposed to be. But like, how many is the executive branch going to enforce that? And don't think of like the president or the governor, but like, is local law enforcement going to like issue tickets? I mean, I know in our area or some of the counties out here, like the sheriff, I think it was of Riverside County or San Bernardino County, came out and just issued a blanket statement. We are not ever going to issue like a citation for a mask. We're never doing it. Like, probably for many different reasons, but they're just like, we're not. So I mean, if your law enforcement refuses to enforce a law, it's more of a suggestion. You know what I mean? Like how it works out in reality. Now, from the business's standpoint, right, there are other agencies like, the health department can shut them down or things like that. But even to coronavirus and the mask mandates, you can kind of see that push and pull between, an executive order and other members of the executive branch saying we're not going to enforce that. I don't know, it's super interesting when you start to kind of look for it. And I'm trying to think of some other laws. Can you guys think of any other laws that, like, marijuana is the most glaring federal law? I'm trying to think what other laws just aren't enforced. Or sometimes, people feel like the speed limit. Yeah, jaywalking, that's a good one, right? Like, very rarely, I mean, I do know a couple of people who've received a jaywalking ticket, but right, it's super rare. So almost like, is that really a thing? Like, or even, yeah, Chris, yeah. immigration is another interesting rabbit hole on that one, right? You know, there's millions of people in very much in legal limbo, right? But that law for many years, I mean, this is like every president, you know, for many years, it's just never been enforced. And now all of a sudden, you know, it's super crazy, right? Super extreme to have someone say they're going to start enforcing something that hasn't been enforced for 25 years, right? What's, I don't know what the word, disruptive, extreme, you know, and it's so where you're right though, but if it's not enforced, so that's a great observation there. Yeah, I'm thinking even the speed limit sometimes, right? I mean, obviously the speed limit is enforced, do not speed, but I mean, do people really go 65 on the freeway in California? You know what I mean? Like, drop a 2 if you are like, people go faster than 65 on the freeway or whatever. Is the speed limit 75? I don't even know what it is anymore, but yeah, it's like no one, I mean, I don't want to say that because you'll be the person that will get a ticket. I will be the person that will get a ticket. But, you know, it's sort of just like everyone's kind of doing something, and, you know, if no one's enforcing it, you know, it's very interesting. And then if it does get enforced and everyone's like, that's crazy, you know, maybe the judicial branch would push back on that. So super interesting, right? To think about it that way. I don't know what others, but yeah, so this would be one of the big kind of deep thoughts that I hope you'll start kind of looking for and thinking about. And I'm sure this is a new thought. Sometimes I don't know, like, do your other CJ professors, you know, have they already told you something like this? But this is probably more like the philosophical underpinnings, you know, if you will, of on a deep level, how the 3 branches kind of interact with criminal justice. And so it also makes some sense too as to why the creation of this whole thing, you know, this whole system of government in 1789, you know, not only included the 3 branches, but also all of your criminal procedure rights, you know, the 4th Amendment, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th Amendment. Like, holy cow. Maybe they were smart enough to kind of see this interplay that that we, you know, maybe most of the time don't think about, you know. So I don't know. Any other thoughts or questions? Because I'm thinking, since I totally biffed the Miranda project, and I've got it all ready to go here, I just need to upload it, that I'll let you ruminate on this, let you guys out a little early, and then I'm gonna get the Miranda stuff uploaded. Someone tell me if I don't get it uploaded. Someone send me an email like after a day or 2. You guys are so funny that no one told me. It's like when I'm like, your midterm's due, and then no one tells you that you don't post your midterm until you get to class the next day, and you're like, and everyone's like, oh yeah, we figured. Like, what? So any rate, thoughts or questions, and we will kind of bring this up periodically. So I call this the unification of the 3 branches of government. Maybe I need to write an article or something. It's probably already been written, you know, but at any rate, the unification of the 3 branches of government in the criminal justice system. Yay. So, ta-da. So that's all I have, unless you guys, like, what questions do you guys have? And yeah, so the only assignments you're working on are just the assignments. I'm going to stop the share. Do you guys all have this if I let this go? Maybe chat in if you need me to wait a second. Otherwise, I'm going to start counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2, level up. Okay, so I'm going to take away the share. Enjoy. Let's see here. Let me just stop the share. Let me look at the class. So the only thing you guys are working on is the local procedure key terms. Yeah, I guess I'll make that one available. Why not? We'll make the, no, I'm gonna not make that one available yet. Yeah, so the only assignment, here I'm talking to myself, I'm sorry. The only assignment that's due right now is your module 3, right? Which is just the key terms. I mean, that's just definitions, probably took you 2 seconds. And then the local procedure assignment, which technically isn't due till later tonight. So get those in. And then I know there were some questions about the chapter 4 materials. Yeah, I'll back those up a little bit because we're gonna do our Miranda project on Tuesday. Okay, so yeah. Anyway, so that's where I'm at. That's what you're doing. I'm gonna stop recording. Beep.